Thanks for clicking. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm a mortgage broker here in London, Ontario. It finally happened. Evergrande defaulted on its debt.
You crazy son of a debt.
Failing to repay $80 million at the end of its 30-day grace period after missing its payment last month. This came on the heels after the Evergrande founder was summoned by Chinese authorities after Evergrande released a statement saying it would be unable to meet its obligations.
Yeah.
We also saw a default from Kaisa, a real estate developer that we talked about last week, who holds the second largest amount of offshore debt right behind Evergrande. They also were declared in default by Fitch Ratings this week. And then we saw a number of developments from the Chinese authorities as they attempt to manage this crisis. So what I wanted to do today is go over the Evergrande saga, as it was quite a week for the distressed developer. Then we'll briefly go over Kaisa, as it also had a troubled week. Then I really want to go over the steps being taken by China to help to contain this crisis, this real estate crisis throughout the Communist Party state, as Beijing's ability to effectively manage this will really be a barometer for how much this affects us in the West, in Canada and in the United States, and in both of our real estate markets. And then we'll also end off with a brief discussion about how it looks, at least initially, how this could affect us here in Canada and in the U.S. We do have more updates coming out next week on Canada's inflation data, which will have a direct impact on interest rates. And we also have some more news coming out of the Bank of Canada as they attempt to explain how they are setting their interest rate policy and maybe when we can potentially expect to get interest rate hikes finally here in Canada. So if you want to get those updates, click like and subscribe. But for now, let's get into Evergrande. Evergrande made major headlines on Friday when it announced that there was no guarantee that the group will have sufficient funds to continue to perform its financial obligations. Feeling a little caught off guard by the surprise announcement, Chinese authorities summoned Evergrande's founder to come and see them and explain the report.
You got payments you can't make? You come see me. Work out a plan.
So the announcement must not have been very well received. As a result of Evergrande's release that it might not be able to make its obligations, its stock was down by 20% on Monday. Then the big news came on Tuesday that they had failed to meet their obligations, that they had failed to make that bond payment at the end of their 30-day grace period. Then it was announced that the government and Evergrande would be creating a risk committee, which would help with the restructuring of Evergrande's debt. By Wednesday, Evergrande shares had hit an all-time low, and then the hammer finally came down, what everybody's been waiting for. Evergrande was declared officially in default by at latest Thursday morning. So yeah, we've been talking about it for months now. We've been trying to track this development, and everybody kind of said the writing was on the wall, and that Evergrande was not eventually going to be able to meet its obligations, and it finally happened this week. It really just happened. That's why we're having our China update early this week on Thursday, because I did want to get this out there. Speaking of being declared in default, Kaisa, not to be outdone, was also declared in default on Thursday morning.
I'm a person too, Bob. I'm a person too.
You're a moron.
We spoke last week about Kaisa offering investors a bond swap, which basically amounted to an 18-month extension with no additional funds going towards investors for allowing that extension. As of last week, the bondholders had rejected the offer, and as of this week, as of at latest, again, Thursday morning, Kaisa missed their payments, and they have also been downgraded to default status. So, as of right now, we have the two largest holders of offshore debt, Evergrande and Kaisa, both having defaulted on their debts, on their offshore debts, on their offshore debt obligations. So that means they haven't paid the money to investors from the West. I mean, this is a big deal. This is really what everybody has been waiting for, mainly Evergrande, but also Kaisa, as it does hold the second most amount of debt. For its part, China has definitely been getting its hands wrapped around this. We had already discussed that China had stepped in with Evergrande and created this risk committee, which is basically the government is going to oversee this restructuring. They're going to make sure that the right people get paid. There has been reports that China is going to mandate that onshore creditors get their money first, and that their homes that have been bought from Evergrande get built first before the Western investors get their money.
There have been several reports quoting sources as saying that Evergrande intends to prioritize the domestic market for its funds, where the stakes are perceived, according to sources, to be higher for the financial system.
And we're going to talk about that in a second. But the pressure is definitely on the Chinese government to effectively manage this crisis properly. The stock markets do seem to think that China can manage this crisis properly, as stocks were actually up on the news that Evergrande had missed their payments. So they do seem to be responding well and showing a lot of confidence in China to be able to manage this. And China's actually already started taking steps, cutting the reserve ratio, the ratio requirements that the banks have to have in order to lend out money. So Chinese banking, and our banking for that matter, is based off the fractional reserve system. It's not like it's in It's a Wonderful Life, where your money's in Joe's house.
Well, your money's in Joe's house. That's right next to yours. And in the Kennedy house and Mrs. Maitland's house.
When the banks that lend out money, they are mandated that they have to have a certain amount of capital reserves, a certain amount of money actually on hand, and then they can lend out a multiplier of that money, be it 10 times, 15 times, 20 times, etc., etc. All debates of the fractional reserve system aside, what China did this week was cut the amount of money that banks have to have on hand in order to lend out a certain amount of money. This was expected to free up 1.2 trillion won, which is around $190 billion. And this is the second time that China has done this. They also did it in July when they cut the reserve ratios initially, which freed up about another 1 trillion won. And you know what they say, 1 trillion won here, 1 trillion won there. After a while, that adds up to real money. People say that, right?
Who says that? No one says that.
The major problem with this is that it does weaken the banks. It weakens the cushion that the banks have at their disposal. It makes them more susceptible to external shocks, more susceptible to big shocks in the market, which very well could be coming. We don't really know exactly how this crisis is going to unfold. But it is still nonetheless good to see that the Chinese authorities are getting their arms around this and that they do plan to manage this crisis with the full power of the Chinese state, which is considerable. And they are definitely not done yet. The Chinese authorities have a whole lot of tools at their disposal for getting money into the market, which they definitely plan on doing.
There will be also easing of credit policy, so that the restrictions on developers, on mortgage, on LGFE, on other sectors will also be eased. Support for SMEs. There will be fiscal easing as well, and property policies will be eased.
So how about the West? How about United States and Canada? How about our real estate? There's a number of initial problems right away that could come up. Evergrande owes $19.2 billion to offshore bondholders. For the most part, that means those in the West. $19.2 billion isn't nothing, and the loss of that money would impact our economy, not to a great extent, but it could. But the real problem comes with the contagion. When Evergrande defaults, it has defaulted, but when as it's defaulted, this could very well trigger cross defaults over a number of other properties. Imagine, say, you're an investor in, let's just say, Canada, and you have borrowed money in Canada, and as collateral, you've used your bonds that are being held by Evergrande. News of their default, news that they're not going to be able to pay their bonds. Everybody figured they wouldn't be able to pay their bonds, but now we know. This is why it's official. So now that collateral is no longer useful on that loan that you have in Canada. This is one of the biggest worries that we have going forward. There hasn't been any news of it yet, but this is going to take weeks, months, probably years to get through this restructuring. And China is not exactly well known for being open about its books. They're not exactly being well known for being open with their data. They don't have the same standards that we do have in the West. Amount and extent and severity of this crisis is going to become more and more well known as this unfolds, now that this default has happened. The other major concern is what this is going to do to the Chinese economy. When these real estate developers don't pay their debts and they default, this is going to put tremendous strain on the property sector, which, because it accounts for nearly 25% of China's GDP, is going to put tremendous strain on the rest of the country. And if you're a lender and you know that companies in China right now are having problems paying their debts, if Beijing doesn't manage this properly, if some of the right investors, the right people, don't get their money back, you're going to want a big price premium to loan money to China. You're going to, because the risk is so high, you're not going to loan money to China very cheaply. So China Chinese companies are going to, their cost of borrowing money goes sky high. When those costs go sky high, that gets translated into higher goods that are sold from China to the U.S. and to Canada. Just in Canada alone, there was a report showing that Chinese that our trade with China accounted for over $50 billion of Canada's GDP. Imports from China are substantial into Canada, and as those prices increase, that is going to put major pressure on our inflation rate. And as we're seeing right now, we already have major problems with our inflation rate, and as the inflation rate goes up, the Bank of Canada, the central banks, the Federal Reserve are going to be under even more pressure to raise rates, to raise interest rates, to raise the cost of borrowing in order to tamp that inflation down. And there we have it, this crisis in China directly affecting our real estate market. So to summarize very succinctly, cost of borrowing goes up in China. Those costs are passed down to goods. Canada imports those goods at a higher price, forcing our inflation rate up, forcing our interest rates up, forcing the higher cost of borrowing harder to get more difficult to get real estate. Maybe our real estate prices go down. Maybe they level off. We don't know how high our inflation rate is going to go. We already have supply chain issues. We already have Omicron. We have a number of issues putting pressure on our inflation rate. And this default in China, this continuing unfolding real estate crisis in China, will definitely, directly or indirectly, have an effect on our real estate market. And I can't see it being positive. There are other ways in which this crisis could and probably will affect our real estate market, which we've gone through in other videos, as investors either move their money from China into Canada, into our real estate assets, depending on how this plays out, or dump their current real estate assets that they have in Canada in order to shore up their positions in China. That's a quick summary because we've gone through this before. But definitely there's all sorts of numerous ways that this crisis, this real estate crisis, this default of Evergrande, is going to, one way or another, hit our shores. If you do want to get those updates, make sure you click like and subscribe, and thanks so much for watching.